This is Colonial Oak Music Park. It's one of my absolute favorite places to play in Florida. It's just a beautiful venue with such a cool atmosphere and vibe and always brings a great crowd. But there's one thing about it that isn't so beautiful as a venue. The voltage coming out of the power outlets is too high. Now, I'm not trying to just single out this one venue because tons and tons of power outlets all around the world have the issue of putting out too much voltage. Why does this matter, you ask? Long story short, running a guitar amp, and especially a tube amp, and especially a vintage tube amp, at too high of a voltage is bad news. Not only can it make your amp sound and feel worse to play, it can also seriously damage your tube amp. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to get a device that can reduce the voltage before it gets to your guitar amp. One of the most well-known examples of this is the Variac, which is short for Variable AC Voltage Regulator, which Eddie Van Halen famously used to get the so-called brown sound out of his Marshall Plexi amps. But I don't have a Variac, so what I'm going to use today, and the subject of today's video, is the Brown Box input voltage attenuator made by AmpRx out in Nashville, Tennessee. I was fortunate enough to meet the kind folks from AmpRx out at NAMM this past January, and they were generous enough to send me home with this Brown Box. So huge thank you to Clark, Cassandra, and my buddy Connor Kelly for hooking me up with this thing. They didn't ask me to make this video, and they have no input on what I say in this video, but for transparency's sake, I just wanted to make it clear that they did, in fact, give me this thing. So do with that what you will. Since NAMM, I've brought the Brown Box to a number of gigs and spent a good amount of time putting it through its paces. So for today's video, I'm going to show you guys how the Brown Box works and do some back-to-back comparisons of an amp running at different voltages to demonstrate the tone and feel difference it makes. So let's get into it. Real quick before we go on with the rest of the video, I just want to let you guys know that I offer private Zoom lessons that you can sign up for at the link in the description of this video, as well as a Patreon channel where I post exclusive content, including a full breakdown of this solo, which many of you guys have seen, where I break down every single lick, every note, dive into the music theory, what I'm thinking, and how I approach improvising over something like this. So if you sign up for my Patreon channel, then you can get access to that video as well as other exclusive content. All right, first things first, how does the Brown Box work? Well, first of all, it plugs into the wall with an AC power cord, and then there's a little on switch. And you'll see that it has a couple outlets right here. So these are where you plug your guitar amps into. You can run two at a time. So instead of just plugging your amp straight into the wall, now this plugs into the wall first, and then you plug your amp into one of these outlets here. You'll see that there's a screen on the front. So the top number is representing the voltage that this is outputting, and the bottom number represents the amperage or the current draw of whatever is plugged into it. So the more stuff you have plugged into this, the higher that amperage number is going to be. Lastly, you'll see that there are two knobs on the front. So this one is active reduction, and this one is voltage attenuation. So the active reduction knob, as you can see, is currently on bypass. So that means that this is not reducing the voltage at all right now. So in order for the Brown Box to start doing anything and start reducing voltage, I have to turn this knob up one notch. And so if I put it back to bypass, you'll see that the voltage coming out of the wall right now is currently 122, 123-ish volts. I've seen it go up to 124 here. And the thing is, modern day guitar amps in the US are designed to run at 120 volts coming out of the wall. And vintage tube amps in the US were designed at even lower voltages because back in the day, wall voltages in the US used to be around 110 to 115, maybe 117, 118 volts at the most. So all of our favorite iconic vintage guitar amps from the 50s and 60s were meant to run at even lower voltages than the typical wall is supposed to even put out today. With a modern tube amp, 122, 123 volts is probably not going to hurt anything. They are designed to be able to handle a little bit extra voltage than the wall is supposed to put out. But with a vintage tube amp, this could potentially do some damage to the components of it. So the gist of what these two knobs do is the active reduction knob is going to be your main adjustment. So as you turn it down the different detents, it's going to reduce the voltage in big steps, essentially. Whereas the voltage attenuation knob, the smaller one here, adjusts in smaller increments. So you use this one to get in the ballpark of where you want to be voltage-wise, and then you use this one to sort of fine-tune it. For example, say I wanted to run my amp at 115 volts. Well, if I go down two notches on this knob, then it gets to 117, but if I go one more, then now we're at 114. So what I'll do is go back to this 117 and then turn this one notch, and we get 115 volts. I can't tell you exactly how this thing works, but essentially it has a couple transformers in it that are working to reduce the voltage coming out of it. And so the important thing to note about the brown box specifically is that you can only reduce voltage. You can't increase voltage. So in my case right now, the voltage coming out of the wall is 122, 123 volts, and I can't increase the voltage any more than that. I can only reduce the voltage from there. As opposed to, say, the Variac that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, that can increase the voltage beyond what the wall is putting out. And so that is part of the reasoning behind the brown box. It is a safety measure to ensure that you never overload your amp with voltage. Now let's do a little comparison so you guys can hear the tone and feel differences of reducing the voltage that your amp sees. The amp I'm going to use today is my clone of a Fender 5E3 Tweed Deluxe that I built. You may notice that it doesn't look very much like a Tweed amp. That's because I hand built it myself at the Gallup School of Lutherie. They have an amp building class that I took while I went there. All of the gain and stuff that you're hearing is just purely from the amp. I'm just plugged straight in and just have the volume on the amp cranked up. I'm going to start with the brown box turned off, so maximum voltage coming from the wall, and play something for you guys, and then gradually reduce the voltage in a few different increments to hear what the difference is. So enough talking, let's get into it. As you can hear, it's not a drastic night and day difference, but as with most YouTube comparisons, it is more noticeable in the room while you're playing it. And especially if you're in a gig situation, there is a noticeable difference in tone and feel. What I found in that comparison was, as I turned the voltage down, the amp got a little quieter, it got a little softer and rounder in the treble frequencies, and it felt a little more compressed and squishy and saggy to play. So for gigging musicians, I feel like this demonstrates that varying wall voltages between different venues can at least partly account for that annoying phenomenon that happens where your tone sounds incredible one night and terrible the next night using the same gear with the same settings, just at a different venue. So for me personally, just now in that comparison and when I've tried it at gigs, I prefer to run the 5E3 Deluxe at around 115 to 117 volts. That's because this model of amp is already pretty dark and rolled off in the treble and compressed anyway, naturally. So I don't want to lower the voltage too much and make the amp too dull and squishy feeling. But I still do want to bring the voltage down closer to what this amp circuit was designed to run at. Because while this particular amp was built just a few years ago, it's a clone of a circuit that was designed in the 1950s. And like I said earlier, wall voltages in the US were lower back then than they are today. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Which voltage did you prefer, and did you even hear a difference at all? After testing out the brown box at different voltages with several different amps, I've found that every amp kind of has its own sweet spot depending on when it was designed and just the overall character of the sound of each amp. For example, my PRS HDRX 20 amp that I was playing at the beginning of the video sounds best right around 120 volts, which makes sense because while that amp has a classic 60s Plexi style sound, it is a modern amp that was designed to run at modern wall voltages. My 1971 Super Reverb, on the other hand, I thought sounded best at a quite low voltage of around 110 to 113 volts. It's a vintage amp, so at that voltage, it's running closer to how it typically would have back when it was first built. And for me personally, while overall I love the Super Reverb sound, it can be a little bit bright and strident and kind of stiff for me sometimes. But I've found that lowering the voltage just smooths out that amp in the best way. And honestly, I have never been happier with the tone and feel of my Super Reverb than I was the night that I plugged it into the brown box at a gig. Can be subjective though, because that same night my bandmate Jack played through a 66 Super Reverb plugged into the brown box, and he thought his amp sounded too dark and dull and compressed with that low of a voltage. He preferred it when I turned the voltage back up to around 120. This could be at least partly due to differences between those two particular amps, because no two vintage amps are exactly alike. But either way, there is no one perfect voltage for every amp or every person. So what's actually happening inside of a tube amp when you raise or lower the input voltage? Well, in the most basic terms, it's changing how much voltage the tubes are receiving, which in turn affects the voltages of various other components throughout the whole rest of the amp, which directly affects the sound and the overall health of your amp. How you bias the tubes of your amp plays a role in this as well, but that's too much to get into in this video. But in general, if an amp receives too much voltage from the wall, then it can essentially overload the tubes and cause them to red plate or overheat to the point of failure. If one or both of your power tubes fail, then it can cause other less easily replaced components in your amp to also receive too much voltage and fail. Basically, it can blow your amp. That exact scenario actually happened to me one time at a gig with a deluxe reverb reissue that I used to have. Tubes were biased properly and everything, but it got too much voltage and it blew. It actually literally had smoke come out of it. So as much as I've been talking about tone and feel and everything in this video, the most important benefit of using a voltage attenuator is peace of mind that your amp is always going to run at safe, optimal voltage levels. And while there are other admittedly cheaper options out there that can perform the same basic task, as far as I can tell, the brown box is the only one of its kind that is designed specifically for use with guitar amps, and especially for gigging musicians. It's smaller, more lightweight, sturdier, and safer for your amp than something like a Variac. AmpRx has a great video on their YouTube channel where they talk about specifically why the brown box is safer for guitar amps than a Variac. It's pretty convincing to me, but go check it out for yourself. Link to that video is in the description down below. So, would I recommend the brown box? Overall, yes. I would say it's a very well-made product that's going to be useful for a lot of guitarists out there. If you only own newer modern amps, then I'm not going to say it's essential, but it is a good safety measure to have. It's not going to hurt anything, and it could be a way for you to kind of nudge your amp into a tonal sweet spot that you wouldn't have found otherwise without it. If you own and especially gig with vintage amps, then I'm going to go ahead and put this in the essential gear category. I wish I had gotten one sooner for my Super Reverb, both for tone's sake, but also just because I shudder at the thought of all of the venues with sketchy power that I've brought that amp to over the years. It's only a matter of time before something goes wrong with any vintage amp, but having something like this can postpone that or can even completely prevent bad things from happening to your amp. So that does it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think of the brown box, and if you own a voltage attenuator, let me know how you like to use it. If you could please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon to get notified whenever I post new videos. That will help out my channel a lot. Don't forget that I offer private Zoom lessons. Link to sign up is in the description below. And I also have a Patreon channel where I post exclusive content, so link to that is in the description as well. Hope to see you guys there, and until next time, take it easy.